Great Schism of 1054, how Christianity split into two great church traditions, East and West. The day, a decree changed history. Imagine, a magnificent cathedral. Hundreds of candles flickering in the darkness, priests standing beneath an enormous dome, and then, in front of the altar, a document is placed. A document carrying a terrifying religious declaration. One side is declaring the other side excommunicated. But here is the question, was this really the moment Christianity was divided into two, or was something far deeper taking place? Behind that dramatic moment lay centuries of political rivalry, struggles for power, linguistic differences, cultural separation, theological disputes, and competing ideas about authority. The place, Constantinople. The year 1054, and the setting, one of the most magnificent churches in the medieval world, Hagia Sophia. Representatives of the Pope had arrived from Rome to negotiate with the Patriarch of Constantinople. But the negotiations failed, and then something happened that would become one of the most powerful symbols in Christian history. The papal representatives placed a decree of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia. Then they walked out of the church. Within hours, the news began spreading. Rome and Constantinople had turned against each other. Today, we know this event as the Great Schism of 1054, the Great Division. But here lies the real mystery. Did Christianity truly split in 1054, or had the seeds of division been planted centuries earlier? And if those seeds had already been planted, who planted them? Rome. Constantinople, the emperors, the popes, or perhaps history itself. Today, we are going back to the first 1,000 years of Christianity. We will discover how people who shared the same faith gradually became part of two very different worlds. How the fall of the Western Roman Empire pushed East and West further apart. Why the authority of the Pope became a source of conflict with Constantinople. Why one small Latin word, filioque, became the center of centuries of theological controversy. And finally, how the dramatic events of 1054 became a symbol of a division whose consequences can still be felt today. This is not simply a story about a religious split. It is a story about power, faith, empire, and the course of human history. Chapter 1. Once there was a united Christian world. Today, Christianity exists in many different traditions. The Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Protestant churches, and many other ancient and modern Christian traditions. But during the earliest centuries of Christianity, these divisions did not yet exist in their modern form. The first Christians did not think of themselves as members of different denominations. They shared one faith, one religious tradition, and a common Christian identity. After the death of Jesus Christ, his followers gradually spread from the Middle East across the Mediterranean world. Jerusalem was one of the earliest centers of the Christian movement. From there, Christianity spread to cities such as Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, and eventually Constantinople. These cities were not only important political centers. They also became major centers of Christian life and leadership. Each had its own traditions, its own religious leaders, its own local customs, yet they were connected by a powerful idea of Christian unity. That unity was never perfect. There were disagreements, there were theological disputes, and sometimes those disputes became extremely bitter. But despite all of this, Christians still largely understood themselves as members of one great church. And this brings us to the first great question of our story. Why did that unity eventually break apart? To understand the answer, we cannot look only at religion. We must look at politics, empire, language, culture, and most importantly, power. Chapter 2, the 5 great centers in the ancient Christian world. 5 cities became especially important: Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, and Constantinople. Over time, these centers became closely associated with the great patriarchal sees of the Christian world, but each city occupied a very different position. Rome had been the ancient capital of the Roman Empire. It was one of the most important political and cultural centers of the Western world. Constantinople, meanwhile, became the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. In the 4th century, Emperor Constantine transformed the ancient city of Byzantium and developed it into a new imperial center. The city became known as Constantinople. Over time, it became the political heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, and something important began to change. Rome and Constantinople were no longer simply two religious centers. They were becoming the centers of two increasingly different political worlds. In the West, Latin dominated. In the East, Greek dominated. In the West, Rome's political power was gradually weakening. In the East, Constantinople was becoming more powerful, and within the same Christian world, two different worlds were slowly taking shape. Chapter 3. When emperors began to shape the future of Christianity, the 4th century was a turning point in Christian history. After Emperor Constantine embraced and supported Christianity, the position of Christians began to change dramatically. For generations, Christians had sometimes faced persecution. Now the situation was beginning to reverse. Christianity was becoming an important religious force within the Roman Empire, and emperors became increasingly interested in the affairs of the church. Why? Because religious unity could also strengthen political unity. If the people of the empire became deeply divided over matters of faith, those divisions could become political problems as well. That is why major church councils were often held under imperial patronage. One of the most famous was the Council of Nicaea in 325. There, Christian leaders debated fundamental questions about Christian belief, but there is something important to remember. Disagreement among Christians did not begin with the Great Schism. From the earliest centuries, Christians had debated major theological questions. What was the nature of Christ? How could Christ be fully divine and fully human? What was the nature of the Holy Spirit? What was the relationship between the Father and the Son? These questions produced intense and sometimes bitter controversies, and those controversies gradually raised another critical question: which council had the final authority? Whose decision was final? Did the Bishop of Rome possess a unique authority over the other bishops, or should the major patriarchates govern the Church through a balance of shared authority? The answers to these questions would eventually become part of the foundation of the future division. Chapter 4: Rome vs. Constantinople. Over time, the relationship between Rome and Constantinople became increasingly complicated. The popes of Rome regarded themselves as successors to the Apostle Peter and claimed a special authority connected with him. According to Christian tradition, Peter was deeply associated with Rome. As a result, the Bishop of Rome came to hold a unique position in the Christian world. But the leaders of the Eastern Church did not accept the idea that the Pope possessed unlimited authority over all Christians. They recognized Rome's special honor, but they did not necessarily accept the idea of universal papal jurisdiction in the later Western sense. Their vision was different. The major centers of Christianity should work together. Rome might hold a position of honor, but that did not necessarily mean that Rome should exercise absolute authority over the Eastern churches. This difference may sound small, but hidden inside it was an enormous question: who should lead the Christian church, one pope, or a communion of patriarchs working together? The two sides did not have the same answer. And once politics became intertwined with this religious question, the conflict became even more complicated. Chapter 5: The Roman Empire becomes two worlds. By the late 4th century, the administrative division between the eastern and western parts of the Roman Empire had become increasingly permanent. East and West, two different political realities were emerging. Then came 476, the traditional date associated with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Rome's political power had been dramatically weakened, but the Eastern Roman Empire survived. Today, we often call it the Byzantine Empire, yet its people continued to think of themselves as Romans. Constantinople became the capital of a powerful and enduring empire. And here a profound contrast began to emerge. In the West, imperial power was collapsing. In the East, the emperor remained powerful. In the West, church leaders increasingly became important figures within the political vacuum left behind by the weakening of imperial authority. In the East, the relationship between the emperor and the church developed within a very different political structure. As a result, the political and cultural distance between Rome and Constantinople continued to grow. Both sides were Christian. Both sides considered themselves heirs to the ancient Roman Christian tradition, but they were increasingly becoming the centers of two different civilizations. Chapter 6: When language changed. The world changed with it. Sometimes a division does not require a war. Sometimes a language is enough. In the West, the main language of the Church was Latin. In the East, Greek. The theological vocabulary of these two languages was not identical. A concept expressed in Latin could carry different nuances when expressed in Greek. Even translations of theological documents could produce subtle differences in meaning. And when the subject is theology, even a single word can become the center of a major controversy. Over time, the religious cultures of East and West also became increasingly different. The style of worship, church music, religious customs, fasting practices, rules concerning married clergy, even certain liturgical traditions began to differ. One important difference concerned the bread used in the Eucharist. In the West, unleavened bread became the established tradition. In the East, leavened bread remained customary. None of these differences, by themselves, caused the Great Schism, But when countless small differences accumulated over centuries, the two sides gradually began to see the other as increasingly unfamiliar. Chapter 7, Filioque. One word, one enormous controversy. Now we come to one of the most famous words in the entire history of the Great Schism, Filioque, a Latin term meaning, and the Son. It relates to the wording of the Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed and the Christian teaching about the procession of the Holy Spirit. The original creed stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. In the Western Christian tradition, the phrase, and the Son, was eventually added. This created two major questions. Was the theological addition itself correct? And perhaps even more importantly, could one part of the Christian Church unilaterally alter the wording of an ecumenical creed? The West argued that the addition expressed a legitimate understanding of Christian theology. The East objected not only to the theological implications, but also to the authority involved. Could one side change a universal creed without the approval of an ecumenical council? The controversy was therefore about more than theology. It was also about authority, and this is where the old tensions between East and West became even deeper. Chapter 8, Photios, and the first great confrontation during the 9th century, tensions reached a new level. Under the Patriarch of Constantinople, Photios' relations between Rome and the Eastern Church became extremely strained. The dispute was not simply about theology. It involved the leadership of Constantinople, the authority of Rome, and political influence. Photios was a highly educated and influential scholar. He became one of the most important figures in the religious world of Constantinople. But his rise created serious tensions with Rome. Rome challenged his position. The Eastern and Western sides issued competing decisions. For a time, the conflict became so serious that both sides took severe religious measures against the other. Eventually, relations were repaired, but the wounds did not disappear. Both sides had now learned an important lesson. If they could not agree on authority and doctrine, their relationship could eventually collapse. Chapter 9, another force before 1054. Politics. It is often a mistake to explain religious divisions through religion alone, because religion and politics were deeply connected. On one side stood the Byzantine emperor, on the other were the political powers of Western Europe, and between them stood Papal Rome. Southern Italy became an important area of competition. Byzantine and Latin influence existed side by side. Religious practices became another source of conflict. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, criticized certain Western practices. Rome, in turn, objected to certain Eastern practices. Meanwhile, the political situation was becoming more dangerous. The Normans were challenging Byzantine influence in southern Italy, and the political calculations of Rome and Constantinople were becoming increasingly intertwined with their religious disagreements. Then, in 1054, a delegation arrived in Constantinople from Rome. Its leading figure was Cardinal Humbert. Their stated purpose was to resolve the growing dispute, but history sometimes takes a strange turn, where those who arrive to repair a relationship end up creating an even deeper crisis. Chapter 10, the day Athagia Sophia. Constantinople was one of the greatest cities in the medieval world, and at its heart stood Hagia Sophia, a magnificent church. Beneath its enormous dome, centuries of Christian imperial history had unfolded. In 1054, representatives from Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople became increasingly hostile toward one another. Cardinal Humbert and Patriarch Michael Cerularius failed to reach an agreement. The tension became unbearable. Eventually, the Roman delegation prepared a document of excommunication, and then they placed it on the altar of Hagia Sophia, a dramatic and unforgettable moment. The Roman representatives turned and left Constantinople. The city was thrown into turmoil. Patriarch Michael Cerularius responded with his own measures against the Roman delegation. But there is a crucial historical point here. Although we now call these events part of the Great Schism, of 1054 people at the time did not necessarily understand them as the final, permanent division of Christianity. The relationship between East and West continued to change for generations. There were still contacts, still negotiations, still attempts at reconciliation. Therefore, 1054 was an important milestone. But it was not the entire story. The deeper separation would develop over the centuries that followed. Chapter 11, the wound that never healed. After 1054, communication between East and West did not suddenly disappear. People continued to travel, trade continued, religious contacts continued, but mistrust was growing. And then came the Fourth Crusade, the year 1204. A crusading army made up largely of Western European Christians attacked Constantinople. Christians attacked a Christian city. Constantinople suffered a devastating sack. Churches were looted. Religious treasures were taken. The city was humiliated. For many Eastern Christians, the event created a deep and lasting hatred toward the Latin Christian West. If 1054 had been a religious and political wound, 1204 poured fire into that wound. For many Eastern Christians, Western Latin Christians were no longer simply Christians with different customs. They became symbols of betrayal and mistrust. The psychological distance between East and West became much harder to overcome. Chapter 12, Could Unity Have Been Restored? For centuries, attempts were made to restore Christian unity, but the Byzantine Empire was becoming increasingly vulnerable. The Ottoman Turks were growing stronger. Constantinople was becoming more isolated. Byzantine emperors desperately needed military assistance from the West. Religious reunion with Rome, therefore, became an important political issue as well. In 1439, at the Council of Florence, representatives from East and West attempted to reach an agreement. For a moment, it seemed as if Christian unity might actually be restored. An agreement was reached on paper, but many Eastern Christians and religious leaders rejected it. For them, the question was not simply could East and West sign an agreement. The deeper question was, would reunion require the East to accept Western authority? And even more importantly, would Eastern Christians have to surrender their own religious traditions and identity? The agreement therefore failed to produce lasting unity. The old division remained. Chapter 13, The Fall of Constantinople then came, 1453. Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II launched his campaign against Constantinople. Massive cannons, thousands of soldiers, huge defensive walls, and inside the city, an empire fighting its final battle. On May 29, 1453, Constantinople fell. The Byzantine Empire came to an end, and Hagia Sophia, the great symbol of the Byzantine Christian world, entered a new chapter of its long history. With the fall of Constantinople, the political center of the Eastern Christian world was transformed, but the Christian tradition itself survived. Eastern Orthodox Christianity continued to develop across Greece, the Balkans, Russia, Eastern Europe, and other regions. Meanwhile, the Roman Catholic Church continued to develop its own vast religious and political tradition across Western Europe. The political worlds had changed, but the religious identities remained. The conclusion, did Christianity really split in 1054? So let us return to the question, did Christianity suddenly split into two in 1054? The answer is no. The real story is far more complicated. The division was a process that developed over many centuries. There were linguistic differences, cultural differences, theological disagreements, the controversy over the filioque, disputes over papal authority, conflicts between the Byzantine emperor and Western political powers, and struggles for influence in regions such as southern Italy. Then came the dramatic events of 1054. And those events became a powerful symbol of the growing division between East and West. Later, the sack of Constantinople in 1204 deepened the hostility even further. There were attempts at reconciliation. There were attempts to restore unity, but the historical wounds had become too deep. Today, Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christianity exist as two distinct church traditions. They share many fundamental elements of ancient Christian faith. Both preserve traditions that reach back to the early centuries of Christianity, yet they differ on important questions of church authority, theological interpretation, liturgical traditions, and religious practice. And perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is this. What began as disagreements among religious leaders, cities, emperors, and political powers eventually became part of the religious identity of hundreds of millions of people. The document placed on the altar of Hagia Sophia in 1054 was therefore more than just a piece of parchment. It became a symbol of a much longer history, a symbol of a lost unity, and a reminder of how deeply faith, power, politics, and identity can become intertwined. Because history teaches us one difficult lesson: great divisions are rarely created in a single day. Small disagreements accumulate. Mistrust grows. Politics becomes intertwined with religion. Culture pushes people further apart. And eventually, one dramatic moment becomes the symbol of a division that lasts for centuries. This was the Great Schism of 1054, the Great Division of Christianity, the long, complex, and dramatic journey through which one ancient Christian world gradually developed into two great church traditions. But one question remains. If Rome and Constantinople had set aside their pride and found a way to reconcile, would the history of Christianity look completely different today? Perhaps we will never know. Because in history, once certain doors close, we can only imagine what might have existed on the other side.